Okay, so for people who are probably watching this on my side, because you recording on your side, right? Or no?
No, 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 not today.
Not
Not
today.
today. I'm relying on you, actually.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so for everybody that's probably wondering why we talking about businesses and all that stuff, we got some socialists out here that really claim that the socialism has never had any flaws in a philosophy. So a socialist has sent me this, so I'm gonna zoom in on this for you guys. Where the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, had the second fastest growing economy of the 20th century, 0% unemployment, zero homelessness, saved the world from Nazi Germany, invented space travel, ended the centuries long cycle of famine in Eastern Europe. Hopefully, I'm saying that right. Higher calorie of consumption than the USA, which even the FBI came out and said that was false. Ended racial equality, which is
We'll
also
get to it.
yeah, we'll get there. Yeah, ended racial inequality, ended sexual inequality, free education, 99% literacy rate, most doctors per capita in the world, eliminated poverty, and double life expectancy. And then,
Let's put a pause here, and before we read the capitalism part, if you can,
okay, go.
because I think that we should handle it maybe in two parts,
Uh huh.
just so we understand how ridiculous this is. So there's not a single straightforward proper statement here that's not quite easily dismissed and debunked, and I think that we should do that. So first of all, they're saying the metrics are really weird.
Mm-hmm.
Second fastest growing economy of the 20th century. Now, this is true, but there's always a catch. There's always a catch. The metric that they're using to measure their growth is GDP, most likely GDP per capita. And it's true that the Soviet Union, after the initial upheavals and up to the Second World War, grew very, very rapidly in terms of industry. But the word per capita is very important here, is that at the same time, a lot of people's lives were sacrificed, and the industry was not to produce social goods. It was not to improve the quality of life of people. Now, the quality of life of people did improve slightly because it's industrialization anyway. It's not all empty capacity. Now, what's omitted also as well is that what happened earlier. The Russian Empire, since the late 19th century, which is, 1860s is the American Civil War. In 1860, Russia also had some upheavals with its monarchy. And towards the 1880s, 1890s, there were a lot of reforms that were passed. The reforms were the partial elimination of serfdom and the people's attachment to lands, the ability of landowners, of farmers to get ownership of their own land by, paying the nobility the price for that land through their own income, which many successfully managed to do because they were highly productive. And if you look at the data they're using, most likely, from my experience, they're quoting the Madison Project, which is a project to estimate the GDP. You can find it on ourworldindata.com. If you look for GDP per capita in the search bar, Madison data will be one of the projects they link to, and they will feature direct links to the actual project where you can download the data as an Excel spreadsheet. So this is a scholarly project, academic project to estimate global GDP for centuries in the past, for several hundred years.
So
Now,
I'm sorry for what you said. They took the farms and other industries and basically said yo, we taking over yeah jobs or yeah companies over here, and we making it ours now. Is that that's what you said, right?
no. So I'll try to get there very briefly.
Right.
As soon as those reforms happened in the Russian Empire, now what tax rate does the Russian Empire have? After the 1890s, the tax rate is below, as far as I know, is below 10%, maybe below 5%. So the monarchy is not taking a lot out of the economy by the standards of, maybe it's a lot by the standards of the time, but compared to what followed, it's almost nothing. And the monarchy is therefore not like, it's very rich on the level of that the king can, eat out of golden plates, but his empire as a whole, his military expenses, his expenses on government are very low compared to what followed, and compared to, say, the American economy. It's a tiny fraction. It was a very tiny government with a monarch in charge, and when they liberated the various inputs into the economy surged forward with a slight delay after the United States. Now, the economy was very agrarian. It was based on people working the land and producing food, but the empire controlled one of the most fertile places on earth, where farmers could produce a lot of food quite easily if they weren't meddled with, which they did. It was very rare for the economy to have famines, and it would require like some extraordinary weather conditions to produce them. But population grew very rapidly from that moment on, and population growth, in my mind, exceeded industrialization. So they were a lot more people were surviving in the villages, moving into towns, and not finding jobs. That created social upheaval, and I believe that is what is ultimately responsible, along with the failures in World War I, with Russian monarchy attempting to meddle in European affairs and getting a lot of people killed and wasting a lot of money, going bankrupt. That caused the revolution, the first one. The king abdicates, and the socialists take charge of the country. And they try to reform it to basically free the workers, free more people, supposedly. But there is a parallel government established by the Bolsheviks, local unions, trade unions, as part of the factories that actually start controlling things, acting as the court, as the police, as like enforcers of regulations. And in 6 months, they capture the entire country, and they perform a second revolution against other socialists, an anti-democratic revolution, meaning the original socialists were in control based on the voting. They won the vote. But these Bolsheviks came in and took everything through an armed revolt. That caused also a counter-revolution where the military, basically that used to be like the king's military, the sort of white forces, they rebelled against that, because the Bolsheviks openly announced that they're going to expropriate, meaning take from private individuals into the state everything that everybody owns.
Right.
They wanted to implement communism immediately instead of gradually. And even though a lot of property in Russia at the time was like not legitimate, meaning it was nobility, various, people with questionable merits as to how they achieved what they owned, monopolists and such. Also, because it had such a free economy up to that point, and a rapidly growing economy, and in industry, a lot of the businesses and factories were proper, privately owned, often owned by foreign investors. For example, what happens in a country that industrializes is that one of the most profitable businesses is creating local factories to produce other factories.
Right.
So you create a factory to produce the machines that are placed in a factory. It's much easier to do it locally because they're heavy and transportation costs are astronomical back at the time. So they would try to produce industry in Russia to enhance industrialization. Who was doing that? Anyone that could. Zinger, which is like a German name, various Germans, various English people, a few Americans would invest in factories at the time in Russia and China, actually, and they're for similar reasons, because there's cheap labor. A lot of people want to work at a factory. There's a lot of people surviving and moving into the cities. And at the same time, there's a great demand for your product. So it's very profitable to provide these goods. This is what the Bolsheviks ended. So to say that it was the second fastest growing economy of the 20th century, yes, after you pause it for another 10 years of like the Revolutionary War and the absolute mess that they created, if you look at the Madison data, it's a climb up to World War I, Then obviously as during the wartime a decline, then a climb after the war, and then a collapse as the planned economy takes hold, and then a climb. Why? Because Vladimir Lenin notices that the economy is collapsing, that there's starvation. He introduces the new economic program, NEP, I believe, or New Economic Plan, which is actually a return to a free market. He gives the farmers free market to produce and sell foods with minimum interference. He allows people to gain homestead land that they already reside on and gives them that land as their property. And he allows people to sell and buy property in land so that, you know, people who are good at their job and produce can buy more and produce more, and people who are bad end up bankrupt and have to sell.
Vladimir Lenin, he brought forth free market, and he brought forth privatization for some people out here to make sure they administer like food and a whole bunch and a lot of other appliances that people may need. That doesn't really sound like, you know, socialism. That sounds like he was promoting like some other philosophy.
Maybe. Yes. He was there were factions that were accusing him of being a counter-revolutionary for that program, and it was very, very quickly curtailed by Stalin. Towards when Stalin took over, which I believe is towards the turn between the 20s and the 30s, if I'm not mistaken. So Lenin gets sick with, I believe, syphilis and other diseases, and ends up dying, and is replaced by his number one enforcer, who has the history of being a robber, like a bandit, a bank robber, basically. Who several times gets caught by the authorities, but the authorities are fairly mild in how they treat revolutionaries at the time. They send him off to, a remote location. Initially, they send him off to prison, which he escapes, and he becomes like the violent sort of man, the right-hand man of Lenin. Ends up taking over the entire thing because whoever controls the violence controls the state.
Right.
He's like in charge of information gathering of the Secret Service, which is also like a position of power. He knows everybody's basically secrets, and so he's able to take over. What he does is he pushes the country to a different type of industrialization that is centrally planned, and the budgets are increasingly militaristic. So let's talk about this for a little bit. What's a normal military budget in a modern European nation?
You asked the wrong person that question.
In percentage points, maybe the audience will know. In percentage points, what Trump demanded of the European, the NATO members, is to contribute 2% of their economy each year to the military.
Right.
And most of them were before Trump insisted on it, were doing like 1%. And that's when he was doing the whole hullabaloo about you need to like do your fair share for like the joint military effort.
Yeah, even still like that, the funding was they still added more funding to that, and like they put so much money into the military, and the military was still basically declining at that rate though. So that whole it did not really work out like during that time because the military sign-up was declining.
Wait, in the Soviet Union or here?
Oh no, in the United States. I'm talking about when Trump was in office.
Oh yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah.
No, it's different. But America spends more than 2% of our GDP on the military. I think the government takes in roughly 20% of the GDP each year on average. Mm-hmm. It prints out a lot more, so it actually effectively probably takes more like 30 to 40% because of the money printing. But without the money printing, and how big is our military budget out of that 20%? Maybe like I don't remember exactly. We should look it up. If it's a quarter, then that's 5% roughly. So we're probably spending more than European countries by like several orders, because we also outspend them like all combined as the number one spender on military in the world. Now in the Soviet Union, let's say that it's 5%. Even if I'm wrong, let's just give me this stat: 5% we're spending on our military of the entire GDP of the country.
And for United States, right?
Yes, United States.
3.1.
The Soviet Union was more than that number, I don't know where it started, but I know that by the middle of the 30s, it was close to 30%, and by the end, towards World War II, towards like 39, it was more like 40% of the economy was spent on equipment, on military manufacturing. This is a rate that is not sustainable. It is not economically sustainable. So you're building cannons and tanks and airplanes instead of building other factories. Instead of building, instead of building a tractor, you're building a tank in a tractor factory.
Right.
Now, that has consequences for the economy because you see extra tanks and you can record, oh, in the GDP increased. The government ordered more tanks. It ordered more security. Do we include security in the GDP? If we do, then, our GDP is still rising. But there's a split because the civilian GDP, the one that goes towards making people's lives better and making manufacturing cheaper, that goes almost flat, and the military takes over.
Yeah. Okay. So for what it says right here, you was pretty much correct. The military spending was around 10 to 20% of Soviet GDP, around twice USA spending. That's what it says right here.
Yeah, and from my understanding, it increased. The other thing that it is a problem with this data is that once you have a totalitarian government in charge of keeping records, nobody is actually keeping good records.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
There's no independent news journalist that will show up and say, "Oh, you're cheating."
Oh yeah, because I'm pretty sure that they did the same thing when it pertained to Germany. They did not want private journalists in a country. Any private journalists that they found, they end up throwing them in the concentration camps, or they end up deporting them. Yes. So I do remember that. Yes.
So in the Soviet Union, there was no all freedoms, including freedom of the press. The other thing that's is eliminated. The other thing with the command economy is taxation. We said that taxation in the empire was a few percentage points roughly. Maybe somebody will correct me and it's higher, but it doesn't matter how high it was. In the Soviet Union, it became 100%. You do not own what you make.
100%.
You get. Well, yes, you don't get any profit. You're not allowed to have any profit. The government takes everything and then it says, okay, this is what you earned, right? But it doesn't really know how much you earned, but because it doesn't calculate it necessarily. But it says you produced, 10 tanks or 1,000 tanks at your factory, and you're the factory manager. Doesn't matter. You don't have personal stake in the matter. You have a salary. You might get a little bit of a bonus, but your salary is the salary of an engineer or a manager. It's prescribed by the government. And everybody on the factory floor, regardless of how well they work, get the same salary.
That sounds like a freaking rip. That is a rip. Like, people got. I'm not going to say that they got scraps, because they was like making some sort of profit, but it doesn't sound like they was making a profit that was sustainable for them to actually make a good, honest living. It was like they was just making a profit to just make it through the day or make it through the week.
Well, just remember, the money was used mostly at the time for extra expenses, because everything else was quote unquote free. You would get your meals at the factory. You would have a meal ticket. Often when there is a shortage of food, you will just actually get direct tickets to buy food at a local distribution center. You would arrive there and say, here's a ticket for a loaf of bread, and you'll get a loaf of bread. And you would have an allocation of how many loaves per family you can have. It was basically, everything was supposed to be regulated and by quota of every product that you would get. So the money would be in order to spend on extra stuff. Some stuff did have prices. For example, you could go and buy a watch. You could go and buy a camera when they were available. You could go buy extra piece of furniture. That would be something you would pay for by that money that you would be paid. A lot of your expenses would be taken care of. However, it also means that if you need a car and we produce tanks instead of cars, well, your waiting period is 10 years. let's
ten,
say, right?
10 years for a car.
But potentially, right? And it varied in time. Or like housing, pre-war housing was not a big priority initially. So like the housing was very cheap, so you would get like a like what they would do is they would take a rich man's like former banker's apartment and cut up each room in possibly half, install a door, and so like instead of like a 10-room apartment, they'll make it like a you know a 15-room apartment instead with one bathroom, one bedroom, oh sorry, one kitchen, and all and put a family in each half room, and those families would all live in this collective, basically um, using up the space that was previously some one rich guy. Now it did help people solve get off the street in some cases. It did help them mitigate like population increase and various pressures, but it didn't create good living conditions. And many of the people who were building factories were reportedly living in almost tent cities, like in very, very rough housing, temporary housing. So
So how was people getting to work if they was living in 10 different cities if the transportation was so bad?
no, you people would live in a tent city right next to a factory,
Oh, okay. Okay.
or they would live in a military barracks. So the cheapest way to produce, a worker would live in a barracks, would have no privacy, like an open floor beds, and it wasn't like one thing that happened. It was a mix of temporary solutions to an increase in the population and a reduction in economic spending on the people, because now, so the second fastest growing economy of the 20th century is technically true with a big asterisk of what it involved, what they were spending it on. And because the guy at the top was deciding what everybody else gets to spend on, he was saying, we need more tanks. We need a particular type of tank. We need a particular type of, military equipment. And why do we need that? So that's, we'll get to it, hopefully. Let's go to the next one. 0% unemployment. Yes. So this is awful economically. The reason we need to have unemployment is because unemployment is a job. If somebody is unemployed, they're looking for a job, and that's a job.
Right.
It should be treated as a job. What you're doing is you're trying to find a place where you can make more money, meaning you can help more people. You can be more helpful to customers. You can help your society better. So what happens when you forbid unemployment? It means that somebody has to, at the same time as they're trying to get another job to improve the efficiency, they also still have a full-time job where they work. Now, you think it's good because they keep getting money, but also they have less incentive and less time to actually find a better place for themselves, to potentially educate themselves in a new skill, right? They're stuck. And in fact, they're disincentivized to even look. They can just perform their existing job into the minimum capacity before getting fired or before getting a reprimand. They can't really be fired. And so 0% unemployment is like a horrible economic statistic. It's nothing to be proud of. The other thing is that also they didn't recognize some jobs as jobs. So all of these lefties, who are making art and selling each other poetry and fairy images and all of that other and anime and all that other good stuff,
Right.
or producing music videos or producing any other entertainment content, those would be considered exploiters, would be considered freeloaders, would actually the proper name they would be called, and they would be forced to take a factory job or like a cleaning job or some manual labor job.
So anything independent people would try to portray, they would take people in charge in the USSR. They would take that as not a real job. It's either you working in a factory or you just doing something that's completely a complete waste of time.
Yeah, well, yes. What would happen is a lot of people who needed to work at some artistic job, they would convert that job into something more quote unquote material, more concrete. So if you're an artist, very likely you would have to work as a decorator. So they would send you from project to project to create paintings, to create murals, you would be working with your hand, like actually doing the stuff with the hammer, putting it together. You would be restoring buildings. You're a restorer, but you would not like design. Very limited people were allowed to be designers. The idea was that we'll design the perfect building once or twice or 3 times in a very limited design bureau, and nobody else needs to design. We'll copy the thing and we'll place copies of it all throughout the country.
So okay, to add this in, they could not do what they wanted to do because the USSR government said it was stupid. So what they did was put them in the job as more as a construction, more of a as a concreter or a carpenter and all that stuff. That's the purpose that they use their passions for.
Yes, yes, yes. So I'm talking about creative people.
Yeah.
Creative people would get assigned or would get like pushed towards picking an actual profession. Somebody might be a janitor. Somebody might go, if they are a writer, they might become a journalist. So their main job is a journalist, and on the side they get to write, a book. It will be something like this, some type of solution like that will allow creatives to still exist. Or design professions would be integrated into basically as close to implementation as possible. Less designers, more implementing. Now, nothing necessarily like there's negatives about the economy to doing this, but it does create zero unemployment. Literally, it's illegal for you to be unemployed. You would be put in a special up to a prison where you would be forced to work. Now, the other thing that happened with zero unemployment is that's something good to mention. The construction of the Bellamore Canal, the White Sea Canal, which is, I believe, a northern canal connecting a river of Russia to the Northern Sea, if I'm not mistaken. That canal was built with slave labor, with people. How a lot of our activists say that American there's slavery in the American penitentiary system in the jails because they're forced to work. Yeah. Well, in the Soviet Union, they were also forced to work, but they were forced to work to death. And a good documentary that talks about it. There is a BBC documentary called Gulag. It's hard to track. It's not on YouTube, but it has the evidence is first-hand accounts recorded on video from people that survived it. For people like an old man who was the overseer, an old man who was the one of the workers that survived, an old man like an old woman that worked at a nearby business and observed both of them. So there's a lot of evidence was recorded by the BBC in the 90s and the 80s. Direct interviews with people who survived that, and they openly say that human life was not considered worth anything if you were a prisoner. So a prisoner can work at the bottom of a shaft, digging, and a shipment of concrete comes in, and if the worker doesn't come out in time, then the concrete goes over the top. That's like a rare occurrence, obviously, but that would be like the mentality. If somebody, there's no OSHA, there's no safety and security. If somebody gets stuck, and the work has to go on because there's a plan to execute on time. And so the head count of the dead for that construction project was in the tens of thousands, I think up to 100,000 by some estimates.
So, and did they at least get fed a decent?
Yeah. Well, that's a question. Decent, I wouldn't say so, but enough to not die immediately.
Okay, so basically they just fed them just to keep them around for probably like a week or so, or
maybe more. I don't know what the life expectancy was for a worker there, but I know that a lot of these people were also like considered political prisoners. So what would happen is some disgruntled worker would write a report saying that you said like an anti-communist joke and you're a potential spy and a provocateur and a saboteur, and that complaint would go to a particular department that had a quota. That said each day we need to find and convict 100 infiltrator saboteurs in a particular city. And that's according to that quota, pre-written quota of the guilty. They would find people that they could somehow claim guilt of, and then they would ship those people out to the job site to satisfy the supply for that labor. And it wasn't like a court system; it was a tribunal. So they would hear a name, they would say guilty, and they would either say, for some they would say execution, for others they would say 5-10 years hard labor, and the person would be shipped off to satisfy the demand for the jobs.
Yeah, I think I heard something like that from Tick History from one of his videos when discussing the USSR and the gulags and the camps. It was horrendous hearing that, and the fact that some people just gloss over like those kind of conditions, especially when pertaining to like the gulags, thinking like it wasn't that bad, and thinking like, oh, people had the choice to just move away or move out of these certain conditions when they couldn't even like go against with their own free will. It was basically just you guys have to do what we say, otherwise we just gonna, like you said, execute you. It's
Yes.
I don't see how people could just gloss this over like it's something to be celebrated with
Well,
the USSR.
the reason why they can gloss it over is because it's not everybody that was the victim. There was always people who managed to survive, in part because they were writing their reports. Somebody who writes the report is a dangerous individual, and if nobody writes a report about them, they manage to survive. But what actually happened is that there was like a generational murder. Sort of a similar thing happened in the Cultural Revolution in China, where the people who were the first wave of complainers became so dangerous that somebody would complain about them, and they would end up in a prison alongside occasionally the people that they put in that prison, in that work camp. And it was a very hilarious thing to see like an ideologically, passionate person, a communist, a party believer, say, well, I'm going to get killed, but it's all good because the party doesn't make mistakes. I must have made a mistake somewhere. I must have been like the evil guy. It was ideology at the time was very, very, the indoctrination was very, very high. Everybody felt very, quote unquote, patriotic or inspired about the communist idea. Now, they write 0% homelessness. That is true eventually. After World War II, they started rapidly investing in construction, and they built entire cities very, very fast. They did it quite smart. That's something you can't dog them. Like in terms of providing housing, they created factories for houses, and they did a lot of things right for the short term. For the short term, very few people were homeless. In order to be homeless in the USSR, you had to be mentally unstable, pretty much. I think, yeah, people you'd have to like escape alcoholism and continuously escape jobs and be like on the far edges of society. It wasn't very common. However, the space that a family had was minuscule. All rooms were half the size of American standards, and everything was a short-term solution. So something that in the 60s was a brilliant new apartment was designed for 10 or 20 years exploitation.
Right.
And was actually used for like 40 years or more.
Yeah, for what you also told me back then is that a lot of people who worked in the factory jobs, they end up getting some homes right there next to the factories, so they could be quick clock in, clock out, and then they'll be right there, and then next day they'll be ready to do it all over again. You did say that when it pertains to like the factory jobs, they did give them some homes, but you also said the homes were severely small and very uncomfortable for a lot of individuals.
Well, listen, I'm willing to give them credit here. They eliminated, quote unquote, in a country ravaged by war, they managed to get the surviving population into good living conditions within a fairly rapid amount of time. And we don't have a comparison of how it could have been done under a free market system. So we don't have like a real experiment here. We're not being scientific. We're just saying that yes, they did achieve close to 0% homelessness. That's a check mark. The issue is that what was the long-term cost of producing housing this way, of producing housing that is of temporary and low quality, without building up the wealth required to maintain it, the wealth required to, and without giving people a sense of ownership of what they own. That's another thing that's missing. People believe that they own the walls of their apartment, so the inside of the apartment tends to be very well maintained, but outside everything is communal, which causes some issues of degradation with facilities, that people don't have an ownership stake in where they live. That is like a major problem. Now, that problem is a lesser problem than homelessness. So, like when a communist says that they've solved homelessness by this directive, in the short term, let's give them that, yes. In the long term, there's bigger problems that show up that are severe, and so this is where it connects to the rebound that will happen much later on.
Right.
But we can go quicker possibly for some of the next ones because they're less important. Well, except this one: save the world from Nazi Germany. Again, technically true. The highest contribution to the World War II effort was definitely by the USSR. Why though? Why was World War II happening? Part of the reason is because in the 30s, the enemy of fascists, the great enemy of fascists, Stalin, has instructed his people in the workers' parties in Germany to stop. They initially fought the fascists in the streets, the Antifa stuff, all of that is happening.
Right.
But during one of the elections, they were told to basically stand down and to allow the fascists, more or less allow the fascists to take over the government. Hitler's rise to power is in part because the Soviet International, commanded by Stalin, told the communists to lay off, to allow them to rise to power. This is perhaps in the range of close to a conspiracy. You can say, you have conflicting facts. I'm going to just leave it at that, right? We can. This is up to research,
right?
But it's not very, very important. We have a fact. There is a fact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a military alliance between the USSR, Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany, and it was a military alliance to conquer Poland and to split up all the Baltic countries between the belligerents, with many of them going to the USSR. That is a historical fact, signed with images of even the signatures, and everything is available, beyond dispute. There's various excuses why, and attempts to rename this into not an alliance, because it's very dirty to have an alliance with the Nazis in your history books. So they call it a contract of necessity or whatever. They try to shift it around. What is not told often to people is that before that, there was a clandestine operation by the Soviet Union to supply oil, gas, natural resources, and military equipment to help rearm Germany. Including in Ukraine, German commanders and air and plane operators, pilots, would train on bases in Russia. Germans were photographed visiting Russian factories that were built in the late 30s by Ford. So an American was paid with the food money from starving Russians to come to Russia to build factories for cars and tanks.
Wait,
that was the Ford Corporation.
Right. Yeah. I want to make sure I'm casting this right. The USSR had some type of deal with Ford, like Henry Ford and his company, to supply to Nazi Germany. No, they would supply. So the American, the Ford would show up to Russia and build a factory. Okay.
Order the materials, organize the work, bring in his own equipment from America to build more equipment, and he would help industrialize. And he was paid by money that was expropriated by Stalin from the working and the farming class.
Right.
So part of that economy was, instead of paying salaries to people, it would pay Ford who came in to help industrialize, and other, not just him, other industrialists as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the capitalists were helping, some of the capitalist businesses were helping the Soviet Union industrialize, and the Nazis were allowed access to these factories to copy equipment, to get things, knowledge that they otherwise are blockaded from having because of the Versailles Pact and various trade restrictions that they had. So Russians would supply tractor components that had dual use as tank engines and tank components, and a lot of very early German reindustrialization leading up to after World War II occurred with the help of the USSR. Initially, they're enemies, and then in the late 30s, they become increasingly more and more friendly in action, in recorded fact, and then that becomes formalized into an agreement to split Poland in half. And what the USSR does is a brilliant move, a pro-gamer move, as they say. They are late by 2 weeks. So Nazi Germany invades Poland. All of the global alliance, the Allies declare war on Nazi Germany because they've promised Poland the Poland's security, and the USSR is waiting for 2 weeks, and then as the Polish army is engaged on one front against the Germans, the Soviets roll in and stab the Poles in the back, betray them, cut up their supply lines, conquer, get up to Warsaw, and execute 50,000 Polish officers and commanders in one of their greatest massacres. I believe it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's Katyn, in the forest of Katyn, then the town of Katyn.
Mm-hmm.
So they are a direct participant in that aggression, in that war. They only take a pause because they don't want to have, in my mind, they took a pause because they didn't want to be associated with the aggression itself. And they presented it as if they were helping Poland. They were stopping the fascists from taking the rest of it, even though their secret agreement was basically that they were going to split it up anyway, and they were executing, members of the nobility, the military, the intelligentsia. They were capturing people that could oppose them, that could create a partisan Polish movement, and they would execute them summarily. Wow. So that's how the Soviet Union saved the world from Nazi Germany, by supplying Nazi Germany and opening the doors for the war and giving Germany the breathing room of the 2 years between 39 and 41, when Germany did have plans on Russia. These were not allied. These were two snakes temporarily allied with each other. Both of them planned to betray each other. That's part of history. Hitler openly spoke about wanting to conquer Russia, right? But they had an alliance of convenience. Why remains, we'll leave it outside. There's many theories. Look at the Soviet offensive plan controversy on Wikipedia and look at the authors on both sides. There's various theories why that happened, but it did happen. And so they saved the world from an evil that they helped build up.
So everybody during that time was this plot on each other from the socialists to the fascists. There was this plan on each other to try to get one over, because what you said, the USSR waited 2 weeks, and then when things seemed like it was going to de-escalate, that's when they came in and seized. Not to
de-escalate. They came in because they wanted to grab their share of all of those countries. It's not like they came into Poland. They also conquered the Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, all of those northern countries near the sea, Northern Sea, and they conquered pieces of Poland, which they actually later would assign to the Ukrainian Republic.
Okay.
We won't go into those politics, hopefully, but that's what they did, and the reason they did it is because they didn't want. I believe they didn't want all the blame. Germany received all of the blame because it was first, and the USSR could maintain some plausible deniability that they weren't a co-belligerent. But in newspapers of that era, there is a famous caricature of Poland, the cake, being cut up by Stalin and Hitler, because people did see through that subterfuge even back then. It was sort of obvious.
That does, yeah.
Um,
That's definitely a pro gamer move right there. I could definitely give the USSR credit for that one.
yeah.
Now,
Now, the other thing is that's important is if you are going to research this, a curious thing that you should look into is that this is my history teacher told me to do this. He was like, look at what was required for World War One and World War Two. I'm going to skip World War One, but for World War Two to happen, oil had to be provided to Germany,
right,
and there were and oil and I believe gunpowder was maybe for World War One, but oil had to be provided, and a lot of synthetic gunpowder was what had to be provided. So two things happened before World War One. The company Bayer, which is a giant chemical and pharmaceutical company today, but a chemical company back then, introduced synthetic oil or synthetic fuel. They managed to synthesize fuel out of other chemical products. And that contributed, that allowed Germany some breathing room. It didn't completely fill up the oil economy, but the other oil fields were in Romania, which are very, very close to Russia. It is like Eastern Europe.
right.
So the Romanian oil fields were necessary, and Germany had to have access to them to be at a lesser deficit than before. And Germany was at an oil deficit for the majority of World War II, and was desperately trying to get to the Russian oil that was in the Caucasian, past the Caucasian mountains. The reason why they attacked for Ukraine is because they were trying to reach that, as you will, if you watch Tick History, you probably know about it. One of the prongs didn't go against Moscow, didn't go against Leningrad, which was the capital, the capital of the empire. It went south into the southern oil fields, attempting to seize the oil, to deprive it from the Russian war machine and to give it to the Nazis. So they had a relationship where the Soviet Union was supplying them with the oil to offset the deficit, to enable them to attack France, to enable them to attack Netherlands, to enable them to attack the British. And some of those oil shipments continued up until the moment that Germany was attacking. They would be like, I think in some cases maybe within the same day, they would still like bring in, and Germany seized a lot of equipment on the border that was basically already intended for them.
So what's it? Yeah, what you saying? If it wasn't for the USSR supplying the oil to to Nazi Germany during those times, then not the Germany would pretty much not have attacked any of these other countries.
It could have, no, I think it would have attacked anyway. But the amount of success they had with like the blitzkriegs, with like the rapid attacks using mechanized infantry that requires oil to move around, all of these like half tracks that they build, all of these trucks that they operate. To be fair, a lot of the German army was still horse and carriage, even as they went into Russia, but it still consumed a lot of oil through the industrialization and mechanization that they did have. They were still quite mechanized. They had like 3,000 tanks when they went into Russia, roughly, and a lot more like propelled equipment and trucks. So all of that required oil. Rubber required oil. A lot of like their economy required oil as like a component of other things. So
they supplied them equipment, and they supplied them some oil. Is
another resource.
Is there multiple other things that they supplied them?
Now there is a slight thing that I don't fully understand. In Spain, when Franco, the dictator that was like a more fascist, let's just say, was fighting against communists, like a communist rebellion in his country, or maybe he was the rebel. I don't know, depending on how you look at it. The USSR was helping, sending volunteers to fight for the communists, right, for sure, including pilots, and they were training some of their military in Spain. Germany was doing the same thing. So Germany and the USSR practiced a little war to train their troops in the Spanish Civil War. Also, like a known historical fact. But towards the end of that war and towards the late 1930s, from like sort of Cold War rivals, Nazi Germany and USSR become temporarily allies.
Okay.
So this point about save the world from Nazi Germany, also with great American help throughout. Americans were helping the USSR greatly. American citizens were shipping food to Russia during the imperial times, during the Soviet times, multiple millions of dollars in donations that were buying poultry from American farmers, transferring across the Atlantic to feed the starving Russians and Ukrainians. And this continued even into the USSR, and then the governments did the land lease program where they shipped a lot of equipment into Russia. Now, Russia would still probably have won the war, but would the length of the war have doubled without American assistance? Quite possibly.
So it was capitalism that pretty much helped the USSR kind of take down the Nazi Germany.
Yes, Russia is responsible for supplying most of the manpower, most of the human losses, civilian and military losses occurred on the Russian side definitively at a huge rate compared to the Americans. Americans lost like maybe 1/10 of what Russia lost in military personnel. But in terms of military equipment, yes, they were assisted by capitalists to defeat the autarkic fascists of Nazi Germany.
Wow, I'm glad I figured that out.
So the USSR, it is a very common thing for capitalists to assist people that they later fight against. This is sort of a trend, which is fine. Nazi Germany quite deserved the treatment that it got. Not disputing. We probably should have helped. When Churchill said that if Satan would offer help against Hitler, he would take it, something like that. He was probably right. He should have shot Satan right after, but you can't get everything. Now let's look at the rest is sort of petty, more or less. Higher calorie consumption than the USA. Again, there's a thing called empty calories. There's overcounting. Prague's Ben has a great article on this that I will we can link it at the bottom of a video,
right,
where he goes over, and you need to read the debunk, but they're using very shoddy data to prove it.
Oh yeah, I read that from I read that article where the FBI did come out and say like this was severely false because the amount of calories that the U.S. got was severely higher than the amount of calories that the people in the USSR got. I definitely remember reading that.
It's not just calorie; it's also the quality of food. Right. Now, it's not simple. After the Second World War, there is a rise in the economy. Now, unfortunately, that rise is also misleading because it is still military. Military spending still was very high. I don't know what the percentage is after the war, but it didn't go below double digits. It was still in the double digits. It was still unsustainable economically in the long term, which is my belief a partial reason why the USSR eventually collapsed, because it overspent. Every time you don't spend a dollar, quote unquote, a currency on security, on the economy, and you instead force it to be spent on too much security, on excessive security, your economy competition with the rest of the world goes down, and there's like compound weaknesses that get generated.
Yeah.
People have less free time. There's less education. There's less technology. There's less technology adoption. There's less automation. So everything was falling behind. They could never automate, even though they got a whole bunch of computerization from the West. They were constantly copying up until the late 80s. They were copying technology, inventing some, but copying most of the stuff that ended up like on the shelves and in the military use. Like at least 50-50 in key industries. The price of it was too high for them to automate everything. And also local factory leaders did not want centralization of information and did not want to automate information flow to like create a Soviet internet. The idea was there for them to create their own internet, but it was refused at a high party and mid-party level because it deprived those party leaders from exercising the control they had. because towards the end of their system, it was more closely resembling a feudalist hierarchy, like a fascist hierarchy,
Okay.
with local lords controlling individual industries and local lords controlling individual factories. It was more like the nightmare that they assigned to capitalism. That was the actual nightmare that the giant corporation of the USSR created. If you look at the definition of fascism as the government control over the means of production for the purposes of strengthening the state and state control and control by a single party, then the USSR is classically fascist, economically fascist, similar to Italy. Now, let's go down towards racial inequality, which is important. If they were classically an Italian-style fascists in the 50s and 60s, beyond that, they became almost Nazi-like in their behavior. They didn't commit a lot of ethnic cleansing, a lot of genocides. They didn't commit them on the level of Germans after the war, but before the war, they killed millions of people. Not selected genetically, but selected by their occupation and the profession of their family, and by their family's history, and by their loyalty to the party, real or perceived. So,
You said no,
one of the
you said that they wasn't being selective, but it sounds like that they was being really selective about a couple of things.
yeah, well, for sure, but it's fair to say they weren't racialist about it.
Okay.
They were trying to eliminate a class of people. So, like, and the class could have multiple quote unquote racial ethnic groups within it. They didn't much care. However, several ethnic groups did get disproportionately affected, because they were overrepresented in intellectual pursuits and overrepresented in industrial pursuits. Those people suffered. Again, if there was an ethnic representation somewhere, then that was indirectly created like an ethnic negative pressure. Now, what Stalin did towards the last few days of his life, or the last few years and months, was that he was planning to basically ethnically cleanse the Jews from the USSR. There's a famous case called the Plot of the Doctors, where accused doctors, Jewish doctors in particular, trying to do a plot to poison him. And it was like a public show trial where those doctors ended up being sent away into prison sentences. Not always very severe, but they were sent away into both severe and less severe versions of the Gulag. And when he died, he had written plans on gathering all the Jews and sending them to the Far East, to the new Jewish autonomous republic that would have been close to China. So gathering all the Jews from Europe, from Ukraine, from the areas that they conquered, and shipping them off. And for that purpose, in the Soviet passports, there was an ethnic identity, including an indication that you were Jewish. And that indication started to be used for various systems of racial discrimination. And racial discrimination was both negative, meaning a Jew could not enter a university of their choosing because they would, the party would try to distance them, or occupy a high party position potentially. Even though some Jews remained in power, obviously, it wasn't a complete. Stalin didn't get to fully execute what he wanted. But there was an entire generation of Jews in the 60s who felt a lot of pressure, where they didn't get equal opportunities, and it was sort of a very mild level of Jim Crow segregation style, much less than in the United States. I'm not comparing the two, but of a similar flavor to it, of a similar flavor of racial inequality. And the result was that many Jews were disillusioned with the USSR, and in the 70s demanded to be released to various other countries, and Jews from the United States appealed to the USSR government to get the done, to let the people go, as Moses requested as well. And so there was this Moses-style story of, in late 70s, several of the friends of my family ended up in New York, in the United States, and in other places, emigrating out of getting allowed to leave the USSR.
Okay.
And this sort of a second wave occurred in the 90s when the USSR collapsed. Obviously, me and my family were among the families that managed to leave. This is another thing. It's very important to remember. You were not free to leave the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain allowed you to go on vacations in European countries that were controlled by the Soviet Union, but you were allowed to leave maybe the USSR on special work trips with your family staying back as hostages, but you were not allowed to leave the Union at all.
Wait, what?
So you could not say, "Oh, I don't care about the USSR anymore. I want to go live in Europe." No, even if Europe wanted to accept you, even if there's like a guy in Europe who'd said I would sponsor you, you could not leave. The Iron Curtain was there, and people try to escape. So in Berlin, the city is like there's a section of it that's cut off. There's a Berlin Wall that cuts off the city into two parts, and all you have to do is run across the killing field, and you become a free man. And so hundreds of people died trying to cross the no man's land. With people with machine guns specifically were trained and were patrolling the border to kill them.
But to going back to what you said, people could not leave the USSR unless it was they was going out on a business trip or they was going on a vacation to Europe. Anybody that tried to make a break for it,
Yes,
they held their family hostage, or and just to make sure, like a little insurance plan, make sure like you don't stay away from us for too long. Like
yeah.
was there a set period for when some people had to return to the USSR?
Well, there's many stories of people leaving their families and saying, "No, I'm not coming back. I'm a political, migrant, and please save me." And they would stick around, and this would often happen to famous people, and they would have to live with the fact that their family gets pressure in Russia. Now, in the case of people that did it under Stalin, very bad for the family. Off to, there's Gulag is often named, but it's not like the only bad outcome. If you lose your job and you now have to work as a janitor and you lose your apartment, you might lose your children because you're not providing them with enough, and the government says that you can't provide for the children. So there's a lot of ways for the government there to destroy an opposition member or a dissident's family and to destroy their life without actually like killing them. Right? You could forcibly put somebody in a mental institution, for example, and drug them up, which happened to many dissidents. So and potentially their families. So you could take the child and send him off to an orphanage forcibly, and then the child gets to grow without thinking that they were abandoned by the family. There's lots of like really evil stuff you do that doesn't end up in like a kill count. They all survive, but their life is forever ruined.
I can understand why. When they're put into place like in like that by an authoritarian regime, I would feel some kind of bad taste in my mouth as well if that was how it was going to be if some people work for a said company, especially to the people like the father that was probably going out on a business trip, and they said, I'm not coming back here because it's too much oppression, it's too much authoritarianism, and it's too much this and that. There's no free will here. But I would say leaving your child in that situation, your wife, child, it's not a very good look. Like I understand,
no, it's awful.
Yeah, it's awful.
No, it's awful. But you have to understand that the experience of going to the West was a shocking experience. The experience of getting an artifact from the West into Russia, getting a book, getting a piece of bubble gum, getting a pair of jeans, getting a pair of shoes that were manufactured in the capitalist system was as shocking as receiving an alien artifact would be to you. Imagine that you received an alien artifact. I lived through that. Even though it was late 80s, it was much more common to do that, but the first time I saw a Japanese cassette tape player was in the USSR still.
Mm-hmm.
And as a child, it was like it was magic. I never saw technology that slick. Everything that I had technologically was like on the technological level of design stuck in pre-war 50s or 30s. So
Wow.
you would get a piece of equipment like a TV set, and you would be like, that looks like an alien device. We don't design this way. We don't
Yeah.
have such things. A piece of clothing. So before people knew what it was like, just going to like post-war Europe 20 years afterwards in say the 60s and walking into the store and looking at the just wide range of things you could have, that would be like a spiritually shocking experience to a person.
Oh yeah.
And then they have to go back to a place where they feel like the party is like pressing on them and making and trying to get them to suicide, or trying to get them to like end their life in drunkenness, where they look outside and it looks like they lost the war.
Oh yeah. I understand. I understand that wholeheartedly. I get where you're coming from. It's
The
it's just
like
horrible.
the okay so like let's talk. This is very similar. Ended sexual inequality and free education. Technically they did, but sexual inequality is a good thing. Women, I hate to break it to you, some of the viewers, but women are not like men.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
If you
I say this all the time. There's a major difference here. Like, especially here in the U.S. Like, okay, but before I get off topic here,
yeah.
I was about to go in right there, but I had to remember we had to stay a little bit on topic with the USSR and all that stuff. But I'm sorry. What was you
No,
about
no,
to say,
no, no,
Kasimir?
no, no. Listen, let's give them their due. They did they did allow women into many, many fields. They were sexually actually very. Sexual inequality is an interesting. It is interesting that they used sex and not gender. So first of all, the USSR was hyper traditionalists. Right after the revolution, there was a lot of attempts to introduce various quote unquote deviant ideas. So sexual deviancy was skyrocketing. People were doing the whole Woodstock thing of everybody screwing with everybody, and women being very loose.
Mm-hmm.
The Bolsheviks came in and smashed all of that to pieces. So all of these people who are like fluid and and loose and believe that they can have as many partners as they want, they would end up potentially in a mental institution, forcibly taking meds and getting forcibly re-educated to being reintegrated into society. And there'd be huge societal pressure to conform in clothing and in sexual behavior and in de-emphasizing sex and emphasizing childbearing and love. So if you can imagine a hyper-patriarchal United States of your worst nightmares, that was the USSR.
Right.
Sexual liberation was not a thing.
Oh, and you said the Bolsheviks was the ones that wanted to come in and like rearrange the trade unions, or was it to destroy the trade unions?
They wanted to rearrange the entire society,
Okay.
starting with the unions, and what everything was unified. There's a monopoly. It's a big corporation with a monopoly on everything. There's one workers union overall as a system, and there's one professional union for each profession, and there's one party, and there's one source for pretty much everything. The news, there's a central bureau for news. Justice, there's a central bureau for justice. So you have a lot of centralization. Now, does it eliminate some sexual inequality? Well, yes, because a woman is now, there's nothing preventing her from trying to go into a certain profession, but it's very likely that she will be encouraged to actually be put in a sexist position. So she would be encouraged to be a secretary, she would be encouraged to be a typist, she would be encouraged to, in school, there would be like a patriarchal education where she'd be encouraged to behave like a proper female, to play with dolls, to play with dolls of children, so that she learns how to carry a child, to have children. Like all of that was sort of promoted, but there was obviously opportunity for women who wanted to get into management, and many women did.
So
let's give them.
So
that for
no,
sure.
no, okay, but what you said though is they did put them in some sort of positions that was mainly saw it as a female position, then it didn't really end sexual inequality, cause since they was putting them in a much more sexist position.
Well, I was saying the education was patriarchal, but your ability to pick any job for a woman was probably very, very free. So I'm not gonna like there's women in the time that easily entered engineering schools, for example, and became like engineers. There's during the war, women, like in the United States, entered the workforce into factories to a great extent,
Right.
and so a lot of that, they didn't. They definitely ended sex inequality, but in terms of sexual liberation or like sexual activity, none of that was happening. That was a very conservative country,
Okay.
and not just country, conservative culture that was advocated in the rest of the world as well.
Yeah.
Now, the free education, again, the word free in quotation marks, when everybody is a slave, everything is free, right?
Yeah,
We don't count the money.
I mean, I've had the same debate with a relative of mine, where they said, "Oh, free college, free healthcare. If it's getting paid through taxation, it's not free."
Yeah,
But
it's not. But in the USSR, the other thing you have to understand is that a lot of the good education that was there from imperial times. These were people who, from imperial times, were establishing schools. So my father finished a technical school that was built by Mr. Stiglitz. I think it was an industrialist that showed up and built a school named after him in St. Petersburg, Russia.
Okay.
And when it became Leningrad, the Soviets came in, took over that school, renamed it into one of their leaders, which was Mukhina. And so he studied in a school called Mukhina, based on one of the revolutionary female industry leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And he studied, industrial design and art. And but the whole culture of that institution and some of the teachers of the teachers were pre-revolutionary people. And the whole institution, if you look at it today, you would never believe that it's communist, because it wasn't built by communists. And so a lot of the stuff that the communists are sort of using, they're using know-how from scientists that they kept alive and kept working from the Tsarist era.
Okay.
And on their backs, the Russian science kept progressing. Plus, stealing every idea possible from the West, of course. Entire departments would purchase products in the United States, would purchase designs and blueprints, and would ship them over to Russia. Both the military intelligence and the KGB had like major departments dealing with just that. The other thing that they did is they lured over industrialists from Europe, like the Fiat car company. They would lease the design of one of the Fiat cars in the 50s, in the 60s, and they would keep producing that same car for the next half century.
Right.
The same car that they finished producing in Italy in like the 50s, probably.
Oh. So okay, so sorry, kind of lost a train of thought there.
That's about education. So like you have good education, quote unquote, right? It's fairly good education in STEM, but you also have like a system that doesn't reward innovation and entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
So nobody actually invents anything, and all the inventions that are major, that like are iconic cars, like the iconic Soviet car is a Italian car from the 50s.
So there was no economic growth whatsoever.
No, there was, but the military spending was very high, and the economy was always lagging. Partly it was lagging because you lost, partly because World War II, and you lost so many young men during their most fertile years. You lost them to the war, millions of people. Okay. In a country of 150 million, to lose like 10 million plus soldiers and like 20 million civilians is a huge demographic loss.
Right.
You're not like losing the elderly and the children as much, because those get shipped out. You're losing your best people that have to remain near the front. And So that demographic problem plagued them until the end. Major problem. But on top of that, there is no incentive for a person to become very effective at their job because they don't get anything extra for it.
Right.
It's considered sort of silly. Let me tell you a quick story, a quick anecdote told by a famous writer. That writer started his history working at a factory. One of his jobs was at the factory, and he was producing metal parts.
Okay.
Everybody at the factory floor was receiving within his like collective, his unit, his like troop, within his troop, everybody was receiving the same salary. Say, I don't know, 50 to 100 rubles, whatever it was, which was a very decent amount at the time. They would internally track performance in secret in logbooks, and they would use that to gather all the money into a big pool and to give everybody based on their productivity. So they implemented capitalism on the local level among themselves. All right, we're back.
All right, cool.
So let's knock these out. The rest of the stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I think pretty sure you finished free education. We are at the 99% literacy rate.
This is a true achievement, but the problem is that there's every indication that all of the programs that result into this would have happened under Tsarist Russia. Mm-hmm. They like already the level of schooling that people could receive if they wanted it was quite high, and literacy rate is slightly overrated. So if somebody is working at a farm, their requirement for literacy is quite low.
Right.
It still helps them in their life. It improves their ability to negotiate and to engage with modern economy. But at the time, it wasn't as important. And what would happen under the imperial society is that if you were capable enough, and if you had a little bit of money, or you had a little bit of capability to demonstrate talent, or you had some contact with somebody you knew, you could enter an academic institution with I would say with relative ease. It wasn't, there were like schools that were funded by the Tsars, schools that were funded by industrialists that accommodated many poor people. And it's like a fallacy of industrialization where they believe that everybody must know everything or everybody must receive the same education so that everybody can be a factory worker. That sort of was the goal. But we know that it's not like effective in the economy. To do a top-down solution, because some people should have studied agriculture instead of studying how to read and write to that level. Maybe not everybody needs to be like super sharp in mathematics. You know, there's a whole Amish communities in the United States that don't finish high school, and yet they overproduce American farmers. Like they outproduce people that are employed in the United States, as you said, because they know what they need to participate in the economy, because they don't receive much welfare. At least they remain quite independent, and so this demand for 99% literacy is like makes sense today in a literacy-based economy in the United States, but didn't make much sense in the very early imperial era of people working in agriculture.
Okay.
But the trend in literacy was upward. Again, look at the trends in literacy. You will see that they get interrupted by World War I, but they're increasing prior to World War I since the late 1800s in Russia, like in other industrializing countries. So there's no reason, in capitalist countries in Europe that are comparable, literacy rate also went up without, top-down communism of that sort.
Right. I mean, you kind of seen the same thing here in the United States. You just only see it with people who are not in government who are not in government funded schools, like the inner city schools or any other schools that may be government funded. You see the literacy rate increasing in private schools, or most exponentially in homeschooling. So you would definitely see that here. But then you would have some people saying like it's a bad thing that they're in private schools, they're being homeschooled, but then they don't want to talk about the education rate that's going on with people in private school and homeschooled. They want to keep this whole like I'm pretty sure you see what's going on with these with the schools and how they're trying to push out all these progressive policies in these state funded schools. Like they are even trying to push it in private schools, and how they're trying to basically dump people back down to where they can be dependent on government. Or dependent on the state and whatnot.
Yeah, and again, like, should we give them a check mark for a positive achievement that everybody is literate quite early in the society? Yes, but what was the cost to have that central corporate system that they established? The cost was that it also created all the other problems we identified. They were responsible for overproducing military. They were responsible for supplying Nazi Germany that later on made them use up that military, but maybe they didn't need as much security if they wouldn't have supplied the Nazis, right? So all of that is part of the quote unquote free. We can't like separate these two. They're all combined. You don't get one and then not get the other. Like even right now, we have a government that produces a lot of welfare for American citizens, but also we have constant foreign wars. And in order to get a stimulus check for you for like a $1,500 dollars, $3,000 go to big corporations, or if not more,
right,
as part of the same stimulus.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I've definitely had that talk before with a bunch of other individuals. It's like,
yeah, I want to knock out the rest as fast as we can, just so we can like possibly focus on some later. Like most per capita doctors in the world. Okay, and what was the quality of service? The quality of service. Listen, I have horror stories, but let's just say that it's not great. And they use Cuba as an example. The way they lie in statistics in Cuba is phenomenal.
Oh yeah.
They have the highest rate of abortion in the world, with abortions advocated for any children with any deformities.
In Cuba?
Because of that, they have low child mortality because all the danger births are being eliminated before they're even considered born. And the other thing that communists do is they don't consider a child born until a year has passed in some parts of their history.
Wow. That's one thing. I mean, I knew about all the other stuff, but I ain't hear about the abortion rate that happened in Cuba. That's something new to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good FE article about it. There's several people try to write papers. The data is very bad. Like, here's the problem: a communist will say, "Well, prove it, give me the facts, give me the facts." Well, the issue is that how are you getting the facts out of a socialist country? You can get only like secondary sources. You can get evidence. You can get first-hand accounts from people who are living there. So from these accounts, we know that Cuba has and USSR had the same thing. There was a two-tier medical system. There was one for the people in power, for the ruling elite, and there was another one for the common worker. And in order to get into the ruling power elite's hospital, what you would do is you would pay a bribe. So my family, my father, when I was born, I had various medical conditions as a baby. From the cheap hospital where diseases were rampant. And then what my father did is he took some of his salary that he accumulated over time, and instead of like going out and buying, something expensive for the family, he paid, he would buy items and then give them as basically bribes to doctors and to people he know, or just get favors. Maybe it wasn't even a bribe. Maybe it was just a favor that was then somehow returned. To take his baby and get basically me in front of a more experienced doctor.
Right.
It's not like the Soviet Union allocation system that placed me in front of that more capable doctor. It's my father engaging in trade. Right? Now, it's called a bribe in order to demonize it, but really it is free market exchange. The doctor has a limited number of patients he can see, and if somebody brings him an extra resource that he can then spend on his own family, then that person gets priority. Yeah. It's a trade.
Yeah, your father sounds like he was trying to do his best for his son.
Well, these guys saved me, so
Right.
they managed to like stop a fairly nasty infection, as that I heard. But all of that was based. Yeah, you can say, "Oh, it's an anecdote." Listen, there's a lot of these anecdotes, and you should look very carefully at the statistics and try. A good review would be like, let's review the hospitals. Let's look at how they looked in the 80s and the 70s. Just maybe from even available footage, and realize that every single piece of footage has to be approved by the party.
Right.
There's no like independent journalism with iPhones coming into the hospital.
Oh yeah, yeah.
We can see remnants of them.
Oh we didn't really get any of that during the lockdowns either. Cause until there was some people who actually gave some videos, I'm pretty sure a lot of people saw it on Twitter where they saw like how the hospital was in Cuba and how the hospitals was. You know, you had water just coming down the roof. The lights were dim. The hallways were messy. People were screaming. People didn't have the best medicine. Like I've saw that from a bunch of other independent outlets, and people still say like Cuba's healthcare system is one of the best. And
Yeah,
I say, do you guys not actually watch what's going on in Cuba, or are you just going to say it's propaganda again? Most people will say it's just propaganda, and you know
yeah.
it's one thing you would hear from a lot of disingenuous people, disingenuous individuals.
Uh, for sure. And again, like things like eliminated poverty, doubled life expectancy. Um, those things happened during the USSR for sure, but the trends for them existed before, and comparable countries had that happen to them regardless because technology advanced. So, um, and eliminated poverty is a very nefarious statement. They didn't eliminate poverty because they brushed it under the rug. There was lots of people who, after the war, could not work because there were amputees, because there were war veterans, and the way those war veterans were treated was abysmal. They were almost abandoned, and people had to feed them. People had to give them donations, charity. And there was a famous story that before the USSR hosted the Olympics in various places around the country, they would bring in the military, and the military would gather the homeless and the poor out of the street, and they would ship them off, hundreds of miles away without any ability to return, at least for the duration of those events.
Right.
So to say that they completely eliminate poverty, no system can completely eliminate poverty. There's always people that are poor because they suffer from handicaps. People that are poor because they're mentally damaged, including PTSD after the war. Doubled life expectancy, again, this is just a standard byproduct of industrialization that happened all across the developing world, including the USSR. And the USSR, part of the reason why it could do that is because it engaged in quite significant colonialism in extracting resources from neighboring countries. So it's a very similar story. It was an empire. I call it an empire for a purpose. They called themselves international, but their actions were quite imperial. A lot of the goods that improved our society during the Soviet Union, that helped my family, those goods came purchased from places like Latvia and Estonia and Lithuania and Czechoslovakia, places that were influenced or controlled by the USSR. That's where we get a lot of our good products. And we got them by the USSR manufacturing them there with people that, remember, receive pay stubs instead of their actual salary. So we're benefiting from their harder work culture and work ethic. I believe it was just a cultural difference. There was no reason why Russians couldn't produce the same furniture and other stuff, but they didn't have a history of that.
Right.
And so a lot of the quality production of goods was in Europe. We have European cameras. Eastern Europe produced a lot of our high-tech and equipment because, again, Germans, very industrious, very hardworking at the time of them getting conquered by the USSR. And in East Germany, industry was very much advanced in certain high-tech areas where it was quite backwards in the USSR. The USSR imported entire factories. So doubling life expectancy did happen, um, in part by imperialist looting, which benefited a lot of people. I'm not saying it's all like, no, it's theft, but it did benefit people. So we can give them a check mark there. The other thing is doubled life expectancy. Well, the increased mortality was huge. The demographics of Russia were not following the curve of China or other places around the world. Russia experienced a huge demographic hit from investing so much into the military, and from World War II, which it had a good hand in starting.
So that one right there is just complete. Is just a bogus right there. The double life expectancy.
Yeah, it's sort of bogus, but yeah, a lot of individuals had double life expectancy, but a lot of individuals didn't survive to get that double life expectancy because they died in the war.
Right.
They were wasted during the industrialization. They were wasted, and the quality of, like, listen, the USSR was not like super horrible to live in, but I think here's if you speak to somebody who lives in the United States in a ghetto, right? Like
Right.
a black man who was born in a ghetto. Do they not have like some happy days? Do they not have some happiness with their family? Do they not have some music, some things that they get from surrounding areas? Do they not have some opportunities, even if it's through like some activity that we sometimes frown upon, right?
Oh yeah.
Do they not get some happiness even though they're surrounded by basically a socialist system?
Oh yeah.
No,
Yeah.
they do. They
Yeah. My bad. Yeah. Yeah. I was just gonna say like it's not. The ghetto is not always that bad. It's just like that it's the individuals there that makes it bad. Like you would have some people over here that they want to live a more peaceful life. They just want to be left alone. But then you would have these individuals here that would cause havoc and be like, yo, peace was never an option. Is either and it where we at is either rob, be robbed, kill or be killed. That kind of demographic. It goes half and half. Some is good, some
Yeah,
is fun, and some is bad.
of course. Now, in the Soviet Union, order was sort of maintained quite well because the police was quite eager, and like the judicial system was very harsh. So even though there was a culture, there was like thieves and robbers and all of that, crime was fairly low because everybody would. It was very hard to sort of escape in a totalitarian society. But what I wanted to say is that there was happiness there. Like even but what was especially what was noticeable is in the 60s quality of life skyrocketed for
Mm-hmm.
sure. People had more food, the food was more plentiful, people received new innovations in food occurred where they produced factory produced sausages and other things that enriched the life of the average USSR citizen. And they had occasional days where they would celebrate and they would get like they experienced some plenty. But what they also experience is that a gradual decline in the quality of that plenty. They would be in an increasing amount of sawdust added as cellulose to the sausage factory.
Right.
The sausages would lose the quality in their meat over time. The everything in society would be like you had that feeling that everything is sliding down the drain towards the 70s and 80s and beyond. And at the same time, the products that you noticed that were of quality were all imported. So people would smuggle stuff across Eastern Germany, and Germans that would visit us as friends from East Germany into St. Petersburg would bring with them like a package of Western products. And then we would have a real celebration and we would remember, oh, this is quality. This is how a quality piece of equipment looks like. This is a quality camera. This is a quality, magazine. This is a quality piece of clothing. Eventually, more and more of Western culture started getting imported, and that stabilized some of the loss of quality of life from production within the USSR because we started getting more bits and pieces of life in capitalist countries.
Right. Yeah.
especially in the 80s when it started to, the great thaw off and quote unquote reformation, perestroika started happening.
Yeah. What? Yeah.
That that
Yeah. Definitely what you told me. A whole bunch of capitalist countries did help out the USSR and maintain the infrastructure and a whole bunch of other things.
Yes, but what's important is the Russian economy transitions more and more and more towards oil import towards the West. So the USSR is exporting oil to Europe and gas to Europe, and initially Eastern Europe, but eventually, like towards the late 80s, you put it into one market, it gets everywhere. So the USSR was supplying these resources, and it became the number one source of income. The problem was that oil prices collapsed in the late 80s. So besides a general decline in the population, in the economy, and everything else, there's also this massive shock where their number one export, which is oil and gas, rapidly dropped in prices. The barrel went down to like maybe $20 a barrel, something very low in the early 90s. So when the country experiences the quote-unquote switch to capitalism, which we'll go through next, that occurs during the lowest oil prices possible in an economy that's heavily reliant on oil for its exports and for gaining capital.
Right. Yeah, I got you.
Now, the switch to capitalism, GDP instantly halves. Yes, but it wasn't due to a switch to capitalism. It was due to the encounter of the truth, which is that the GDP was fake, that the factories were in many times. Now, let's be fair here. Partly it is because the factories were not efficient enough, and because the industry was, a lot of it was low tech and fake. But partly it was a deliberate effort by capitalist countries to weaken the USSR as it was collapsing. That did happen. So American experts did come to the USSR and did contribute to this idea of, these old factories need to be shut down and sold to scrap, and you should export resources and import all the goods from the West. That was a deliberate plan by the West to weaken an old enemy that was then a great unknown. It was unknown how, after the revolution, how long Russia will remain like a free country. Mm-hmm. So there was a sort of some nefarious plan to do so, but also partly it is just an economic necessity. If you really suck at something, then you sort of have no choice but to open up the market and have other people provide those goods. So if you want to rebuild your economy, there's some arguments that say you have to close the trade, like limit trade in that industry again. There's some arguments for that, which, libertarians mostly oppose, but there's nuance there. So there could be like a populist argument that Russia was partially sabotaged, but it wasn't sabotaged against by capitalism. It wasn't the capitalism that caused these issues. It was central decisions by the government. So how did the government privatize an industry? It gave it to itself, to cronies, to members of its own party. Is that like a privatization when you give your own people everybody worked to produce a factory, and what you do is you sell it, but you sell it to your buddy. Right. So you didn't privatize it; you robbed all the workers that were invested in that industry.
That's privatization. My bad. I'm sorry. That sounds a lot like what other people say about Nazi Germany when it pertains to the privatization that happened there.
Yes. Well, sure, it was less violent, meaning they used a lot more trickery. For example, there's a factory with 1,000 workers. They distribute 1,000 shares to them, but these workers are unemployed. The factory is not producing anything that anyone needs. There's no more quotas to say, produce this and you'll receive this much salary. You now have to sell it on the market. Nobody wants your stuff anymore. Nobody's buying it to just warehouse it, right? The military industry is collapsing. Mm-hmm. And so these factory workers now have a ticket that says this is worth something, and they need food. So what they do is they trade their shares for food, for a bottle of vodka, for education for their children, for other goods and services. And all of the shares get collected by somebody who is a party official who had money stocked up from robbing that same population. And so former party members become leaders of industry.
Right.
Because nobody did the Nuremberg trial in the USSR. Nobody put those people responsible for all the thefts in jail. They didn't, have to suffer anything. The same KGB agent that in the 50s would put somebody in prison, in the 70s would be like a retired old man. In the 80s, his son, based on the riches that the father accumulated, and finishing like a higher degree program in a more quality institution somewhere in Eastern Europe, now that a member of the elite and a member of a party is an industry leader. And what happens to the common worker that worked their entire life and could not send their child to an institution of learning of that caliber? Well, they get screwed.
Right.
So, let's blame it on capitalism. Well, capitalism, no true capitalism, but really, not. There was some capitalism. The fascism that was occurring was mitigated by the capitalism. The people that were bringing in, like, who was a capitalist? Several known individuals that became rich at the time became rich by going abroad with their own cash, buying produce, buying goods, and going to a market directly to sell them to the people. They would like personally execute the entire supply chain. And those people, that was the first thing that was allowed in the late 80s back in the USSR. They allowed small entrepreneurs and small independent unions to operate.
Did anybody
like
big?
co-ops.
Did anybody big try to come to the USSR, try to buy them out?
Well, not at that stage. A lot of the people who started out, who like big supermarket, the biggest supermarket owner in Russia right now, one of the biggest, started out as like a small time trader. A lot of the people that later on in the late 90s built great empires did start out as small entrepreneurs. They were constantly robbed. Very few of them survived, but the few that did survive that crush. So it's not like capitalism does exist in that system to a small extent.
Right. Okay.
But the issues are not due to capitalism. It's like all of the problems. It's like somebody rules the country for 70 years, and then there's an election, and somebody else gets elected. And as soon as the other person is in charge, you blame him for all of the problems that you spent like 60 plus years creating.
Oh yeah, they do that all the time when it pertains to the U.S. elections. It's always somebody else's fault and not the fault of bad economic policies. Okay, so yeah, just to save some time, let's go ahead and skip some of this down here because I'm pretty sure a lot.
I can summarize it, but a lot of this stuff you have to understand is also a lot of these like data that you say 1 in 10 children lives on the street. Listen, 1 in 10 children could have lived on the street in the Soviet Union and you wouldn't know about it. Why would you wouldn't know about it? Because where was the journalism? The journalism started in the late 80s and in the 90s. That's when we started finding out the truth. That's when the archives got released, and then they got secret again in late 90s. But in the middle, there was like 5 years when we were learning a lot of truth about Russia. A lot of the archives were opened up. When you would get closer to the real statistics, you would find out that a lot of this was a bubble. It was fake. It was a fraud, including how many orphans were there. How many people were with AIDS in the USSR? That was a secret. How many people were with various other STDs were walking around? How many people were alcoholics? A lot of things were kept under small wraps. Now, was this detox the way it was handled by the authorities and the way the Western powers, quote unquote, contributed to this problem, to the prioritization? Was this good? No. I think it was a betrayal of the Russian people. But it wasn't done by capitalists. It was done by our statists, by members of our state, by members of very weird schools of economics. It wasn't anarcho-capitalists going in there and telling them to perform privatization this way. These were members of, Chicago School of Economics, more or less, and other schools of economics in the United States that had potentially very wrong ideas about how to establish a free market economy.
Okay.
And yes, the last line there obviously people who observe that happen, they pine for the old for the old illusion. Their life was effectively better before everything collapsed. Yes, they were living on borrowed time. Yes, it was likely to collapse. It was collapsing under them, but it did accelerate when people were given freedom, because a lot of people were given the freedom to leave, and when millions of people leave the country, you don't have the same economy immediately. That's another thing. Like, my father didn't contribute to the economy in the 90s because he left in 1991. So where was his GDP? It was gone. He was no longer producing for everybody else. And like hundreds of thousands, millions of others also quit because there was a great deal of risk. You were in that prison cell, in that open air prison for many decades, and you always fear that you won't leave and it will close. So even people who are very patriotic, potentially, who could have helped rebuild, they were like, I don't need this.
Right.
I don't need my children to serve in the military.
Right. So yeah. So the statement, Stalin more popular than Putin. Everyone wants the USSR back, even though Putin is not a capitalist. That's one thing I'm not.
No, everything is beautiful in hindsight. Also, remember, under Putin, since the late 90s and into early 2000s, education in Russia rapidly changes. They glorify the old regime. They glorify the old empire. They brush under the rug the crimes of the Soviet Union. These are people who are Soviet. Putin is a KGB agent. He's surrounded by other KGB agents, by former members of the security staff. So he is not like some free market. He plays as if he's like free market church guy. He's very far removed from actual Christian faith. I would call him a fake Christian, role playing Christianity. Because of this, like a decision to put, he wanted to put an icon with his face on it in the middle of a church. You can't be a Christian and do that. You have to be like insane. So he's still like a dirty commie deep inside,
Right.
but he is like there's a weird streak of patriotism in him where he robs the country blind, but at the same time he feels like he can't go anywhere, and so he feels responsibility for its future. It is a very narcissist type of like investment in the country, meaning it is very actually close to, I would say it is close to like fascist leaders. They say great things about let's make all of these countries great, but what are they doing in fact, in action? If they're not actually making the people freer and allow the people to make the country great, if they don't like liberate the people's ability for productive action, they cannot produce what they offer. So Stalin can't do it, Brezhnev can't do it, and Putin can't do it either because he can't do it top down, and you can't liberate people. And one of the reasons is because they have oil.
Right.
They still have the same economy. They don't need people. Putin doesn't need, people like me in Russia. We are obstacles. If all people would think like me, if all libertarians leave Russia tomorrow, I'm not in Russia right now, obviously, right? But there's a lot of people in Russia, including some, distant relatives and such that remain there. I hope that they leave, but other people left, and so. How are you going to get investment when it's more favorable to leave than to fight?
Right.
How do you get investment if your property is not secure? If some, a friend of Putin can show up with men with guns and take your company away if you're too successful?
Right.
Almost every single successful company in current Russia, a lot of them, like their version of Facebook was stolen. Several of their airports were stolen. Several of their supermarket networks were stolen. Their banks were stolen.
And this was from people who tried to own them privately, or was it something different?
Schemes where people with guns show up, and it's called raiding. They like do a raid where people with guns with the police show up and they say, we have a document that's could be a forgery that says this belongs to us now. They evict everybody from the building. They bring in their own staff and they take over a business. And they bribe some of the staff members to stay put. If anyone is disgruntled, if anyone is like lower tier, they might stay and their pay increases. So they stick around.
How can
and but they take over all the property.
how can people say that that's capitalism? Like that sounds nowhere near capitalism.
I mean, it is capitalism on the low level. So if I am a small guy that just like finished military service, finished school, and starts my own small business, if I were to do it in Russia, I would be under capitalism for the little guy. I would have to pay my rent. I would have to pay everything. I would have to like pay for all the city services. I would have to pay more taxes than I'm capable through normal profits. I would go under likely unless I somehow cheat and evade and do other things.
Right.
Um, but if I grow too big, then Big Brother will come in and say, "That's a nice business you have there."
So
The
it's
same thing is the same thing is happening in China today as well. Like Alibaba, that's a nice business you have you have there. Mister what's his name? It was a Alibaba founder.
uh Alibaba founder. Yeah.
Jack Ma.
Uh,
I was going to call him Mao, but I stopped myself.
okay.
Jack Ma, forced into retirement. Like, why isn't he like Bezos building spaceships? Why isn't he investing in his version of a newspaper, participating in Chinese politics? Because he became too powerful, and now it's time to remove him from power.
Right. So this goes back to what you said earlier. It's the best way to make it in places like Russia and China is mainly to build a small business and make sure that it doesn't grow too big. For what you said earlier.
Yeah, or sell it early.
Yeah.
Like sell it before it gets taken over, and go do something else with the money.
Yeah.
So they have these bubbles of. In fact, if you want to start a small business right now in China, as a foreigner, you would have issues because they're very actually they have like not even laws, but they have ways to make sure that you have a Chinese partner working with you. The Chinese guy can start a business there, and he will have more freedom as a business startup than in the United States,
Right.
for sure.
Right. Yeah. That.
On
Yeah. That.
on a
That.
small level.
Yeah. That's definitely not something I'll be looking forward to later on down the road. Like, expect like if I wanted to like build an empire, it would be best to do it here. Yes, it's gonna have more taxes on me, like business taxes and a whole bunch of other taxes that I got to give to freaking Uncle Sam. But at least I could still build it to a much more higher, much more bigger platform if I wanted to. If I want to keep it small, I keep it small. If I want to make it bigger, I'll make it bigger. That's one of the things that is possible when you live here in the United States. If you want to if you want to build yourself a franchise, a huge platform, maybe own you a bunch of land, you can do that. But it still comes at the expense of you still got to pay more taxes in order to do that.
No, absolutely, and I I think that we should definitely appreciate the founding fathers, the United States, and there's a great momentum of freedom here that basically allows many people to be liberated,
Right.
including people that were oppressed in the United States. So it's like it's the United States is a relative to the rest of the world a great liberator for particular reasons. One of the reasons is because people in the USSR were disarmed by their government, and people in Russia continue to be largely disarmed.
Right.
There is no culture of rebellion in the USSR. It's like the biggest. People hate on Amazon. Imagine if Amazon warehouse was the entire country. That is the USSR,
Mm.
and it works occasionally. It gives you occasionally, the product occasionally arrives. But imagine if you had no competition. If let's say that Amazon starts messing with you, there's no Walmart where you could go to and say, Amazon sucks about this product. Let me go find, order it from Walmart now and get a refund. There's no refunds.
Right.
Your order gets delayed by a few years. No refunds. And that's the tragedy. It's like they have a list where there are some things that were good. I'm not going to say everything is bad about the USSR living there. Also, there's great poetry, there's great art, there's great writing, there's great cinema. A lot of it is crypto anti-communist, like hiding it really well.
Right.
Um, Also living in dark times contributes somehow to people's creativity. Their soul yearns for doing something beautiful, and they express themselves. Whereas if you're constantly satisfied and you have constant, Netflix on, it's likely that you won't be too creative, because you get like, you're mentally stimulated and you're entertained.
Right.
So there is like a sort of some kind of a civilizational trade-off like that, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, I get it.
However, there is a reason why I mentioned the ghetto earlier. I forgot. I don't think I said that. One thing does exist, which I think this is why I mentioned it, because I think that's a feeling that those people also share. There is an underlying feeling of mild or even major hopelessness.
That's if they have been okay, and I'm gonna say this from experience. That's only if they don't have any act of let's just say self-respect, because they believe that the only way that they could actually get somewhere is if they put all their faith in this one politician that says they are here to help. They hear the cries, they hear the pain. I mean, they see the pain. They go into some neighborhoods and say, "Oh, we see what's going on here, like all these abandoned buildings, all these condemned buildings," and like they give it this whole speech like, "Oh, what's going on here is it's upsetting," when they're the ones with their policies, they're the ones that did it in the first place. And this is why
Yeah.
when you got individuals like me that call stuff out like this, it's like, yo, this is what's going on, and this is who is actually putting us in the situation in the first place. It sounds like taboo for me, because I'm calling out people that they put faith in, like basically they're entities, they're
Yes.
gods.
But listen, we have to be, I'm slightly empathetic to them, and I'm making a comparison deliberately because it is like there is a cost to living in a depressive environment.
Right.
You do have to struggle against being depressed, being suppressed. And when I say that the USSR was happy at times and happy for my family, my family did have a summer home. We could travel to Ukraine in the summers, and I do remember childhood near the Black Sea, playing in the breeze, in the surf, and having like the time of my life, and eating fresh fruit and doing all of that, and getting the occasional banana once a year. All of that, like or some other rare fruit. All of that, all of that could exist, and good food, from and wines from Georgia, and it was a big empire, and occasionally you got glimpses of wealth, and you had like church and spirituality if you wanted that. You had, even though religion was heavily suppressed, people still exercised it. You had museums, you had art. Life wasn't all bad, but there was this underlying idea that if nothing changes, that you want change, because if nothing changes, you are not fulfilling your life. You are not allowed to do 110%. You're not allowed to like work and get stuff done and move up. Whereas in the United States, even though we have a heavily oppressive government right now with various policies, there are still areas in the United States where you can go to and skyrocket compared to the rest of the world, which is why so many people are crossing the border, illegally.
Right.
This is the most major argument against the contemporary democratic socialist is the migrant. Hassan is complaining about workers being unable to find a job and getting locked into unfair contracts.
Hassan's an idiot.
No, sure, but why? The reason why it's idiocy is because he is also for migration. He likes the idea that people from Latin America come to the United States to vote for the Democratic Party to a large degree. However, what he doesn't tell you about these people is that supposedly they also like work really hard. And what does it mean, work really hard? Does anyone give them anything? Do they get easy welfare? A little bit in some states, in democratic cities perhaps. But they live across the country and work and find housing. And if that means that several men share the same apartment, then so be it. That's and then they, if they were able to get citizenship, they would have the opportunity to rise through the ranks. Right. So why doesn't another person do that has citizenship, has the ability to move anywhere they want without anyone more or less interfering?
Right.
It's like a personal belief. It's some maybe ties to your location that are believed to be really strong, but are actually perhaps not so strong. And people who are migrants, they understand that in order to save my family, I have to live apart from them for a few years, and then bring them over, and then buy them housing, and then make up for the fact that I was missing. They do that, but somehow Americans that have advantages of citizenship and rights cannot. So that's, and again, USSR citizens couldn't do that. There was an iron curtain preventing. There were registration. You couldn't even move within the USSR actually, because you had local registration. You would have to petition to get registered in another region, right, in order to move from time to time.
Yeah. It's just a crazy world we live in right now. But yeah, I mean that we was going at this thing for almost 3 hours now.
Oh really?
Yeah,
oh wow.
Yeah, it's like 2 hours and 38 minutes. Be more specific. But it's but yeah, I do appreciate you for coming on here and telling me more about the USSR, and fact checking a whole bunch of things. I definitely did learn a lot from this conversation alone. Before we close this out, is there anything you want to go ahead and just probably make a statement of?
I think that the data is out there, and people should really research some of these claims, because there's always details that are being omitted for political expediency. Mm-hmm. Try to locate original sources, interviews with people at the time, in the place, what they're saying. And you would be surprised. It's not as beautiful of a story as you're sold. And if you want to find out more, and if you want to ask me questions, free Kasimir on Twitter. I post there, and if I start making content, it'll be featured there as well.
Oh, yeah, you definitely need to make you a YouTube or a Rumble channel. You definitely need to make you that.
Rumble for sure.
Yeah. Kasimir, I appreciate you for coming on, man. Giving more details about the USSR. And we definitely gotta do this again sometime down the road if I have any more questions about socialism and all that stuff.
For sure. And we did an overview. I didn't provide many. I'm sure there was going to be like these communists in the comments who'll be like, "Oh, he didn't give no evidence. He was just speaking out of his ass." Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, listen. Look at the. Everybody, when they quote you Maddox data, go look at the Maddox data. Go look at it from Imperial Russia and onwards. Go do some research, and you will find out that you're being deceived. And potentially in the future, it's definitely on the list, mm-hmm, of the to-do list, to compile the sources that I'm gathering into like a publication. There's going to be articles for sure. As I find out more about Imperial Russia, I do plan a comparison between pre-Civil War Imperial Russia, like the first few decades, the 1.5 decades of the start of the century, and the years between the revolution and the 30s. That would be an interesting comparison where some of these assertions about economics will be tested.
You gonna make an article about it, or are you gonna make a video about it?
Well, article first, and then we'll see.
All right. Yeah, definitely gonna read that. I mean, I do the same thing with Philosophical Zombie Hunter. I read some of his articles, and same thing with Thomas Shelby, I believe it is. Yeah, I read their articles. They're pretty good reads. But once you release your article about it, I would definitely give it a read, Kasimir. And once again, I appreciate you for coming on. Everybody check out his Twitter, Kasimir. It's Kasimir free, right?
Free Kasimir, because it switches the places when you sign up. It's weird.
Free Kasimir at Twitter. Check him out. He does a lot of study on more socialism than I do. Once again, Kasimir, thank you so much for coming on and explaining the USSR. And I hope you have yourself a good night, man.
Yeah, take care.
I appreciate it. Yo, so kind of took me a while to edit this video. Had to make sure I got the best parts in. This video was actually almost 3 hours long, but I had to cut some stuff out so we can go and get into the conversation. But if you guys like the video, you guys want to see more of these videos, let me know in the comment section down below. What y'all think about it. Like I said, check out Kasimir on his Twitter. The links will be in the description box below. Like, comment, subscribe, share the video, hit the notification bell. I will see y'all next one. Peace.